The text message seemed innocent enough. "Thanks for a lovely dinner, Mom. David says the train schedule must have gotten mixed up last night. He feels terrible about the confusion." But 72-year-old Margaret Chin knew there had been no confusion. Her son-in-law had deliberately abandoned her at an empty train station after she refused to immediately hand over what he thought were her modest life savings. What David Richardson didn't realize was that he just made the biggest mistake of his life, not because Margaret was helpless, quite the opposite, but because some people spend decades quietly building exactly the kind of power needed to destroy men like him. David thought he was playing a simple con game against a vulnerable elderly widow. He had no idea he'd just declared war on someone who'd been preparing for this exact kind of battle her entire professional life. This is the story of what happens when a master manipulator meets his match, when calculated cruelty encounters strategic patience, and when someone who spent years being underestimated finally decides it's time to show exactly what that mistake will cost. Buckle up because Margaret Chin is about to teach her son-in-law a lesson he'll never forget, assuming he survives it. The concrete bench at Millbrook Station felt like ice against Margaret's back as the November wind cut through her wool coat. At 72, she'd weathered plenty of cold nights, but none quite like this one. The red taillights of the last train disappeared into the darkness 20 minutes ago, taking with it her only chance of getting home before midnight. She pulled her cardigan tighter and checked her watch again. 9:47 p.m. David had dropped her off at 9:15, plenty of time for the 9:30 train, he'd said. Except there hadn't been a 9:30 train. Sunday service ended at 8:45, something any reasonable person would have checked before making promises about transportation. But then again, Margaret was beginning to understand that David Richardson had never been particularly concerned with keeping promises to her. The evening had started so pleasantly, too. Her daughter Lisa had called Tuesday morning with that bright voice she used when she was trying to hide something. "Mom, David and I were hoping you'd come for dinner this Sunday. Nothing fancy, just family time." There had been something fragile in the invitation, something that made Margaret say yes, even though she'd been looking forward to a quiet evening with her crossword puzzles and chamomile tea. She'd taken the afternoon train into the city, carrying homemade apple turnovers in a covered dish and wearing her best navy dress, the one Robert had always said brought out her eyes. Even after 5 years of widowhood, she still found herself choosing clothes he would have liked, still heard his voice commenting on her appearance, with that gentle humor that had sustained their 43-year marriage. Lisa had met her at the door with a hug that lasted just a beat too long, and Margaret had immediately noticed how thin her daughter had become. At 51, Lisa had always been naturally slender, but now her cheekbones stood out sharply, and there were shadows under her green eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," Margaret had said, meaning it despite her concern. Lisa had inherited Robert's artistic sensibilities along with his stubborn streak, and even stressed and tired, she carried herself with the unconscious grace of someone who'd once dreamed of dancing professionally. "Mom, you brought turnovers." Lisa's smile had brightened genuinely then. "David's going to be so excited. He was just saying yesterday how much he missed your baking." David had appeared in the hallway behind Lisa, filling the doorway with his presence. At 55, he was a large man, not fat, but imposing in the way that successful men often were. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, and his voice carried that particular tone Margaret had learned to recognize over the past 3 years. The sound of someone performing kindness rather than feeling it. "Margaret, always a pleasure," he'd said, though his eyes were already scanning past her, calculating something she couldn't quite identify. "How was the train ride? I hope it wasn't too crowded for you." The subtle condescension in his concern had made her bristle, but she'd smiled politely. "It was perfectly fine, thank you. I've been taking trains since before you were born, David." He'd laughed at that, the kind of laugh that acknowledged humor without finding it particularly funny. Of course, of course. Lisa's always telling me how independent you are. Sometimes I worry we don't help you enough with things. Margaret had followed them into their modest two-bedroom apartment, noting immediately that several pieces of furniture were missing since her last visit 6 months ago. The leather sectional David had been so proud of when they'd first married was gone, replaced by a second-hand love seat that didn't match anything else in the room. The expensive sound system that had dominated one corner had vanished as well, leaving only faint impressions in the carpet where it had once stood. Redecorating, she'd asked, casually setting her purse on the coffee table. We're simplifying, David had answered before Lisa could respond. Getting rid of clutter, Marie Kondo and all that. Sometimes you have to let go of things to make room for what really matters. Lisa had looked uncomfortable with the explanation, but she'd nodded along. David's been helping me declutter my whole life, actually. You wouldn't believe how much unnecessary stuff I was holding on to. Something cold had settled in Margaret's stomach at that statement. In her experience, when men talked about helping women simplify their lives, it rarely ended well for the women involved. But she'd kept her expression neutral and complimented Lisa on how open and spacious the apartment felt. Dinner conversation had flowed awkwardly, punctuated by David's increasingly pointed observations about the cost of everything. The groceries were expensive, he'd complained while carving the roast. The utility bills kept climbing despite their efforts to conserve energy. Lisa's part-time job at the art gallery wasn't bringing in nearly enough to cover her share of expenses. It's just temporary, Lisa had said quietly, pushing food around her plate rather than eating. Once I finish my certification in art therapy, I'll be able to work with clients full-time. The program director says there's a real need for qualified therapists who understand creative expression. David's laugh had held no warmth. That program's costing us $3,000. We don't have, Lisa. Maybe it's time to be realistic about our situation instead of chasing dreams that don't pay the bills. Margaret had watched her daughter's face crumble slightly, saw decades of artistic passion being dismissed with casual cruelty, and felt something harden in her chest. Lisa had always been brilliant, graduating summa cum laude from Northwestern with degrees in both psychology and fine arts. She'd had a promising career as a museum curator before her first marriage ended badly, leaving her emotionally shattered and professionally adrift. Meeting David 3 years ago had seemed like a second chance at happiness, but now Margaret was beginning to wonder if it had actually been something else entirely. Art therapy is a wonderful field, Margaret had said gently. Lisa has such a gift for helping people express themselves creatively. I remember when she was 12, she spent an entire summer teaching art classes to children at the community center. She had this natural ability to help them find their confidence through painting. David's smile had tightened almost imperceptibly. Easy to be supportive when you're not the one paying for it, he'd said, gesturing around their sparse apartment. Look at this place, Margaret. We can barely afford rent as it is. What Lisa needs is a full-time job with benefits, not more expensive classes that might lead to work someday. What David didn't know, what Lisa didn't know either, was that Margaret had been quietly helping with their expenses for months. Anonymous payments to their electric company when service was threatened. Grocery gift cards left in Lisa's mailbox with no return address. Small checks disguised as early birthday presents or holiday bonuses from the gallery where Lisa worked part-time. Margaret had learned to help without being detected, having grown tired of David's pride rejecting assistance, while his selfishness endangered her daughter's well-being. She'd been supporting them financially while watching David systematically destroy Lisa's confidence and dreams, and the frustration of that dynamic had been building for months. After dinner, Lisa had disappeared into the kitchen to make coffee, leaving Margaret alone with David. He'd leaned back in his chair, studying her with calculating eyes that reminded her unpleasantly of the corporate executives she'd dealt with during her working years. You know, Margaret, Lisa worries about you living alone in that little apartment, he'd said, his tone deceptively casual. Have you given any thought to what you'll do when you get older? I mean, really older. Margaret had kept her expression neutral, though every instinct she'd developed over decades of professional negotiations had immediately sharpened. I manage quite well, thank you. Sure, sure, but what happens when you can't? Social Security doesn't go very far these days. He'd leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice taking on that false intimacy of someone sharing confidential concerns. Lisa and I have been talking about the future, about what kind of support system you'll need as you age. The conversation had felt rehearsed, practiced. Margaret had wondered how many times he'd had this discussion with Lisa, planting seeds of worry about her aging mother's financial security and emotional needs. I appreciate your concern, she'd said carefully, but I'm quite independent. Independence is a luxury, Margaret, one that requires resources. His smile had been sharp, then predatory. We're all family here. When the time comes, we'll need to make some practical decisions about pooling resources, sharing responsibilities. Lisa's already worried about what would happen if you had a medical emergency or couldn't take care of yourself anymore. Margaret had understood then that David wasn't concerned about her welfare at all. He was inventory checking his future assets, calculating the value of whatever modest savings an elderly widow might possess. In his mind, she was already a burden to be managed, a problem to be solved with whatever meager resources she might contribute to their household. Lisa had returned with coffee, her presence immediately lightening David's demeanor. He'd become the attentive husband again, asking about her day, complimenting the meal she'd prepared. But Margaret had seen behind the mask, now glimpsed the calculator running behind his eyes as he processed her potential value to their struggling finances. As the evening wound down, Margaret had mentioned needing to catch the 9:30 train home. David had immediately offered to drive her despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of taking public transportation. Nonsense, he'd said, already reaching for his keys. What kind of son-in-law would I be if I let you take the train at night? Besides, it gives us a chance to continue our conversation about family planning. The drive to the station had started normally enough. David had made small talk about the weather, asked polite questions about her week, played the role of the considerate son-in-law. But as they'd gotten closer to Millbrook Station, his demeanor had begun to shift subtly. You know, Margaret, I meant what I said earlier about the future, he'd said, his eyes focused on the road ahead. Lisa's got enough to worry about without adding concerns about your situation to the mix. My situation is quite stable, thank you. Is it though? He'd pulled into the station parking lot, but instead of driving to the passenger drop-off area, he'd parked in a dark corner near the freight loading dock. Look, I'm going to be direct here because I think you deserve honesty. The reasonable tone, the false concern, it had all been so carefully constructed. Margaret had realized that this moment had been planned, that the entire evening had led to this conversation in a dark parking lot where no one could witness what happened next. Lisa and I are struggling financially, really struggling. He'd continued, turning in his seat to face her fully. And frankly, having to worry about what's going to happen to you as you get older is adding stress to our marriage that we can't afford. The audacity had been breathtaking. Here was a man asking her to solve his financial problems while packaging it as concern for his wife's peace of mind. I know you probably have some savings tucked away, he'd said, his voice taking on that practiced sympathy she was learning to despise. Maybe a small life insurance policy, some certificates of deposit. It would mean a lot to Lisa, to both of us, if you'd consider making some arrangements now while you're still healthy enough to make those decisions. Margaret had looked at this man who had married her daughter, who shared Lisa's bed and dreams, who was systematically destroying her self-confidence while plotting to manipulate her elderly mother out of whatever modest savings she might possess. The calculating nature of it, the casual cruelty, had made her stomach turn. "What kind of arrangements?" she'd asked carefully. "Nothing dramatic. Maybe add Lisa as a beneficiary on your accounts. Give her power of attorney so she can help you manage things as you get older. Hell, if you wanted to make things easier, you could even move in with us, pool our resources." His smile had been practiced sympathetic. "I know it's a big decision, but family takes care of family, right?" Margaret had studied this man who thought he could see the entirety of her worth in her modest coat and sensible shoes, who believed that elderly women were automatically vulnerable to manipulation and control. She'd encountered this type before in her professional life, but never from someone who called her family. "I'll need to think about it," she'd said finally. Of course, no pressure." But his smile had said otherwise. "Why don't you take some time, maybe talk to your financial advisor or whoever handles your affairs? We can discuss it more next time." He'd gotten out of the car and walked around to open her door, a gesture of courtesy that had felt more like a threat. As she'd stepped onto the pavement, he'd handed her the small purse she hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Train should be here in about 10 minutes," he'd said, checking his watch with theatrical concern. "You sure you'll be okay?" "I'll be fine, thank you." "Great. Give me a call when you've had time to think things over. Lisa's really hoping we can work something out." He'd been backing away already, keys jingling in his hand, when he'd delivered the final blow. "Take care, Margaret. And remember, we're the only family you have left now." Margaret had watched his taillights disappear around the corner and felt the first flutter of real unease. The platform had been empty, unusually so, for a Sunday evening. She'd walked to the schedule board and felt her heart sink as she'd read the posted times. Sunday service ended at 8:45 p.m. The last train had departed 45 minutes ago. David had known, of course. He checked the schedule before offering to drive her, had planned this moment of abandonment as carefully as he'd planned his manipulation attempt. Leave the old woman stranded, let her spend a night wondering how she'll get home, and maybe she'll be more receptive to his generous offer of family assistance. Now Margaret sat on that empty platform, her purse clutched in her hands, experiencing something she hadn't felt in decades: complete vulnerability. Not because she lacked resources, far from it, but because someone she trusted, someone her daughter loved, had deliberately put her in harm's way to advance his own agenda. The station was located in an industrial area surrounded by warehouses and freight yards. No restaurants, no hotels, no taxi stands. Her cell phone, she realized with growing alarm, was sitting on her kitchen counter at home. She'd been so focused on not forgetting the turnovers and her good purse that she'd walked out without it. The night air was growing colder, and her wool coat wasn't nearly warm enough for an extended stay outdoors. She had $37 in her purse, enough for a cup of coffee if she could find an open cafe, but not enough for a hotel room or a taxi ride across the city. For the first time in years, Margaret felt truly alone and apparently helpless. David had calculated this moment perfectly, had stripped away her independence, and left her to confront her own mortality in the most stark terms possible. But what David Richardson didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly know, was that Margaret Chin had been underestimated before. She'd been dismissed, discounted, and written off by men who thought they could see the entirety of her worth in her quiet demeanor and conservative clothes. They'd all learned eventually that assumptions about elderly women could be dangerously wrong. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Not the flip phone David had seen her use that was for show, a prop she carried to maintain her carefully constructed image. This was her real phone, a sophisticated device encrypted with the kind of security that Fortune 500 companies used to protect their most sensitive communications. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed, then pressed call. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Chin Enterprises emergency line, this is Rosa speaking. Rosa, it's Margaret. I need you to activate Protocol 7. There was a brief pause. Are you safe, ma'am? For now, but I think it's time David Richardson learned exactly who he's been playing games with. Understood. Full background investigation. Everything: financial records, employment history, criminal background, personal relationships. I want to know what brand of coffee he drinks and how often he brushes his teeth. Margaret's voice was calm, professional, the voice that had built an empire from nothing while raising a daughter as a single mother. And the daughter, do you want her protected? Margaret looked out at the empty platform, thinking about Lisa's worried face and David's calculating smile. Yes, but carefully. She doesn't know yet what kind of man she married, and she's not ready for the truth. We'll need to handle this delicately. How delicate? Margaret smiled for the first time since dinner. The kind of delicate that leaves no fingerprints but ensures David Richardson never threatens another woman again. I'll have preliminary information by morning. Do you need extraction from your current location? Not yet. I have a few things to take care of first. But Rosa, make sure our legal team is ready to move quickly when I give the word. And contact Patricia Martinez at the foundation. I think we're about to have some new cases for her to handle. Margaret ended the call and slipped the phone back into her purse. David Richardson thought he'd just manipulated a helpless elderly woman into a vulnerable position. Instead, he declared war on someone who'd built a multi-million-dollar corporation from scratch, who employed some of the most skilled investigators and attorneys in the country, and who had access to resources he couldn't begin to imagine. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and the distant sound of a freight train. Margaret pulled her coat tighter and settled back against the bench, no longer feeling quite so vulnerable. David Richardson was about to learn that the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't a woman with nothing left to lose. It was a woman with everything to protect and the means to do it. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she stared at the phone screen, not from the cold November air, but from the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The call to Rosa had been automatic. Decades of corporate crisis management had taught her to secure her position first, then assess the damage. But now, sitting alone on this abandoned platform, the full weight of what had just happened began to settle over her like a suffocating blanket. David Richardson had abandoned her, deliberately, calculatedly, with the same casual cruelty she'd once seen boardroom predators use against smaller competitors they planned to destroy. She closed her eyes and took 3 deep breaths, an old technique from her early days as a CEO, when hostile takeover attempts and media scrutiny had threatened to overwhelm her. Stay calm, think clearly. Emotion is information, not instruction. But this wasn't business. This was family. This was her daughter's husband, the man Lisa trusted to share her bed, and her future plotting against the mother who'd raised her alone after Robert's sudden heart attack 27 years ago. Margaret opened her phone again and scrolled to Lisa's number. Her finger hovered over the call button for a long moment before she pulled it back. What would she say, sweetheart? Your husband just tried to manipulate me into signing over my assets, and when I didn't immediately agree, he stranded me at a train station to teach me a lesson about family cooperation. Lisa would defend him. Of course she would. She was in love, or at least in love with the version of David he'd presented to her. Margaret had watched it happen over the past 3 years, the gradual erosion of her daughter's confidence, the slow isolation from friends and interests, the careful cultivation of financial dependence disguised as romantic devotion. She'd seen it before in the early days of Chin Enterprises when she'd had to navigate a business world that viewed women as either secretaries or threats. The same pattern of control, the same systematic undermining of independence, the same loving concern that felt more like a cage with each passing day. Instead of calling Lisa, Margaret opened her secure email application and began typing a message to her head of security, James Morrison. James had been with the company for 15 years, a former FBI investigator who specialized in corporate espionage and threat assessment. James Priority 1, Investigation Needed. Target David Richardson, married to my daughter Lisa. Suspected financial manipulation and potential elder abuse. Need complete background within 48 hours. Utilize all resources. This is personal. She paused before hitting send, her finger hovering over the screen. Once she sent this message, there would be no going back. She'd be crossing a line from protective mother to corporate warrior, bringing the full weight of her business empire to bear against her own family member. But then she remembered the calculating look in David's eyes when he'd talked about pooling resources, the practiced way he'd delivered his manipulation, the casual cruelty with which he'd dismissed Lisa's dreams and abandoned her mother. She hit send. Within minutes, her phone buzzed with a response. Message received. Initial scan shows concerning patterns. We'll have preliminary report by 0800 tomorrow. Stay safe, Mrs. Chen. Margaret stared at those words concerning patterns. James Morrison didn't use language like that lightly. If he was seeing red flags already just from a basic database search, then David Richardson's manipulation tonight might be part of something much larger. A freight train rumbled past, its whistle echoing across the empty yards, and Margaret found herself thinking about the subtle signs she'd missed or chosen to ignore over the past 3 years. The way David had gradually taken over Lisa's finances, claiming he was better with numbers. The friends who'd stopped calling the family gatherings Lisa had begun declining with increasingly elaborate excuses. The weight loss, the shadows under her eyes, the careful way she spoke about money and David's career prospects. Margaret had attributed it all to the normal stresses of marriage and financial struggle. She'd even admired what she'd thought was David's protective nature, his desire to shield Lisa from worry. Now she was beginning to understand that protection and control could look remarkably similar from the outside. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text message from an unknown number, Mrs. Chen. This is Detective Sarah Walsh, NYPD. I understand you may have information relevant to an ongoing investigation. Would you be available to speak tomorrow? Margaret stared at the message in confusion. She hadn't contacted any police, hadn't reported tonight's incident. How could there be an ongoing investigation that involved her? She called the number immediately. It rang once before a crisp, professional voice answered. Detective Walsh? This is Margaret Chen. I just received your text message. I'm afraid I don't understand what investigation you're referring to. Mrs. Chen, thank you for calling back so quickly. I'm with the Financial Crimes Unit. We've been investigating a pattern of elder financial abuse targeting women in the tri-state area. Your name came up in connection with David Richardson. Are you familiar with that individual? Margaret's blood went cold. He's married to my daughter. There was a brief pause. Mrs. Chen, I think we need to talk. Are you somewhere safe where we can speak privately? I'm currently stranded at Millbrook Station. It's a long story. Millbrook. That's 30 minutes from my current location. Mrs. Chen, I'm going to send a patrol car to pick you up. We have some things to discuss that I think you need to hear tonight. Detective Walsh, what exactly is David Richardson suspected of? Another pause, longer this time. Mrs. Chen, we've identified at least 4 elderly women who've reported suspicious financial pressure from Mr. Richardson over the past 2 years. 3 of them lost substantial amounts of money before they realized they were being victimized. We believe your daughter's husband is operating what we call a romance-adjacent financial scam targeting vulnerable seniors. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. 4 other women, substantial losses. a pattern of predatory behavior that stretched back years. My daughter, Margaret said quietly. Is she? We don't know yet. That's what we need to discuss. Mrs. Chen, based on what we've uncovered, your daughter may be in more danger than you realize. 20 minutes later, Margaret found herself in the back of a patrol car, her mind reeling as Detective Walsh explained the investigation that had been building around David Richardson for months. The detective was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the weathered expression of someone who'd seen too much human cruelty. It started with a complaint from a woman named Eleanor Hartwell, Detective Walsh explained as they drove through the empty streets. 78-years-old widow living on Social Security and a small pension. She met Richardson at a community center where he was volunteering or claimed to be volunteering. Margaret listened with growing horror as the detective described David's methodology. He targeted recently widowed or divorced women particularly, those who appeared financially vulnerable. He cultivated relationships slowly presenting himself as a caring friend or potential romantic partner. Once trust was established, he'd begin introducing financial emergencies that required immediate assistance. The brilliance of his approach, Detective Walsh continued, is that he never asks directly for money. Instead, he creates situations where the victims feel compelled to offer help. A sick relative who needs surgery, a business opportunity that requires quick investment, a family emergency that threatens his relationship with his children. And they gave him money? Hundreds of thousands of dollars collectively. Eleanor Hartwell lost her entire retirement savings, $47,000, over the course of 6 months. She thought she was helping the man she was falling in love with preserve his relationship with his children. Margaret felt sick. What happened when she ran out of money? He disappeared, changed his phone number, stopped showing up at the community center, blocked her on social media. She didn't hear from him for 3 months until she saw his engagement announcement in the local paper. His engagement to Lisa. Yes, that's when Eleanor contacted us. She was devastated not just by the financial loss, but by the realization that everything she'd felt for him had been manufactured, that his whole relationship with her had been a lie designed to rob her. They pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, its neon sign casting pink and blue shadows across the empty pavement. Detective Walsh led Margaret inside, choosing a corner booth where they could speak privately. Mrs. Chen, we've been watching David Richardson for months, trying to build a case. But he's very careful, very skilled at making his manipulations look like legitimate relationships gone wrong. The victims are often too embarrassed to press charges, too ashamed that they fell for his act. Margaret accepted the coffee the waitress brought, using the warm mug to steady her shaking hands. You said 4 women. What happened to the others? Patricia Martinez lost $32,000. She thought she was investing in a restaurant he was planning to open. Diane Foster gave him $18,000 for his mother's cancer treatment, a mother who doesn't exist. And Ruth Goldberg. Detective Walsh paused, her expression darkening. Ruth died last month, heart attack brought on by the stress of losing her home when she couldn't make mortgage payments after giving David her savings. He killed her. The words came out flat, matter of fact. Indirectly, yes. That's when this became more than just financial fraud for us. When we start seeing victims die from the stress of these crimes, it becomes something else entirely. Margaret stared into her coffee, seeing her own reflection wavering in the dark liquid. My daughter has no idea, does she, about any of this? We don't think so. Our investigation suggests that Richardson uses his relationship with your daughter as cover for his other activities. The respectable marriage, the settled domestic life, it makes him seem trustworthy to his victims. They see a man with a wife and stable home, and they don't suspect he's capable of systematic fraud. But if he's stealing from other women, why come after me? Why risk exposing himself to his wife's family? Detective Walsh leaned forward, her expression grave. Because we think he's escalating. The pattern we're seeing suggests that Richardson is getting bolder, more desperate. Based on our financial analysis, he's been spending the stolen money as fast as he acquires it. He needs bigger scores to maintain his lifestyle. And an elderly widow with what he assumes are modest savings represents easy money with minimal risk. He's already established a relationship with you through your daughter. He has access to your personal information, your daily routines. In his mind, you're the perfect next victim. Margaret felt something cold and dangerous settle in her chest. Detective Walsh, what you're describing, this pattern of targeting elderly women, the systematic financial abuse, the connection to at least one death, this goes far beyond simple fraud. I agree. That's why I'm hoping you'll consider working with us to build a case against him. Margaret looked across the table at this dedicated officer who'd spent months investigating the man her daughter had married, who'd seen the devastation David had caused in other families. What exactly would that involve? We'd need you to document any attempts he makes to manipulate you financially. Record conversations, save messages, keep detailed notes of his behavior. With your help, we might be able to catch him in the act and finally have enough evidence to prosecute. And my daughter. We'd work to protect her throughout the process. But Mrs. Chen, I need you to understand something. Based on what we've observed, your daughter may already be a victim herself. The financial control, the isolation from family and friends, these are classic signs of domestic abuse. Richardson may not be physically harming her, but the psychological and financial manipulation can be just as devastating. Margaret's hands tightened around her coffee mug. Lisa, her brilliant artistic daughter, who'd once painted murals that took your breath away, who'd volunteered at homeless shelters and animal rescues, who'd dreamed of using art to heal trauma, that woman had been systematically dismantled by a predator who saw her as nothing more than cover for his criminal activities. I'll do it, Margaret said quietly. Whatever you need me to do to stop him, I'll do it. Detective Walsh smiled for the first time that evening. Mrs. Chen, I should probably mention we know about Chen Enterprises. We know about your resources and your capabilities. If you're willing to work with us, David Richardson is about to face the kind of investigation he's never encountered before. Margaret returned the smile, and for the first time since being abandoned at that train station, she felt like herself again. Detective Walsh, David Richardson, made a serious mistake tonight. He assumed that I was just another elderly widow with limited options and no one to help me. And he was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. I've spent 40 years building resources specifically designed to protect people like me from people like him. He's about to discover that there's a significant difference between appearing vulnerable and actually being helpless. As they left the diner an hour later, Margaret felt the pieces of a plan beginning to form in her mind. David Richardson thought he'd won tonight's battle by leaving her stranded and desperate. Instead, he'd just declared war on someone with the resources, connections, and motivation to destroy him completely. The only question now was whether she'd give him a chance to surrender before she brought the full weight of her empire down on his head. Somehow, she doubted he'd be smart enough to take it. The next morning found Margaret in her true environment, the 32nd floor corner office of Chen Enterprises, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city skyline. She'd been here since 5:30 a.m., long before her staff arrived, using the quiet hours to transform from abandoned elderly woman back into the CEO who'd built a fortune through careful planning and ruthless execution. Rosa Martinez knocked and entered with Margaret's usual morning coffee, Ethiopian single origin, prepared exactly as she'd preferred it for the past 15 years. Rosa had been Margaret's executive assistant since the company's early growth phase, a woman whose loyalty was absolute and whose discretion had been tested countless times in corporate battles. The preliminary reports are on your desk, Rosa said, setting down the coffee, with hands steady as a surgeon's. James worked through the night on the Richardson investigation. Margaret opened the thick folder, her expression growing darker with each page. James Morrison's work was always thorough, but this investigation had revealed patterns that made her stomach turn. David Richardson wasn't just a casual manipulator, he was a career predator with a sophisticated operation. Rosa canceled my meetings for the week and called Dr. Hartwell at the university. I need to speak with someone who understands the psychology of financial predators. The psychology professor who consulted on the Brennan case. Exactly. And Rosa, this conversation stays between us until I say otherwise. My daughter's safety may depend on absolute confidentiality. Margaret spent the morning absorbing James's findings while her coffee grew cold. David Richardson had left digital footprints across multiple platforms, and James's team had followed every trail with forensic precision. Bank records showed a pattern of small, seemingly innocent transfers from elderly women's accounts. Social media analysis revealed carefully cultivated relationships with lonely widows. Phone records documented hundreds of calls to numbers associated with romance scam operations. But it was the psychological profile that truly chilled her. Dr. Hartwell had reviewed the evidence and concluded that David exhibited classic traits of a psychopathic predator: superficial charm, lack of empathy, and an extraordinary ability to mirror the emotional needs of his victims. Mrs. Chen, Rosa's voice came through the intercom. Detective Walsh is here to see you. Margaret had been expecting this visit. She'd called the detective at 6 a.m., offering the full resources of Chen Enterprises to the police investigation. What she hadn't expected was the look of profound relief on Detective Walsh's face when she entered the office. Mrs. Chen, I have to admit something, the detective said, accepting the chair Margaret gestured toward. When I learned about your corporate background last night, I hoped you might be willing to help us, but I never imagined you'd offer this level of cooperation. Detective Walsh David Richardson made the mistake of targeting my family. I didn't build this company to accumulate wealth. I built it to have power when power was needed. This is one of those times. Margaret activated the secure conference system that connected her office to her team of investigators, attorneys, and security specialists. Within minutes, she'd assembled a task force that would have made federal agencies envious. James, what do we know about Richardson's current financial situation? James Morrison's voice came through crisp and clear from the speakers. He's in serious debt, Mrs. Chen. Credit cards maxed out personal loans and default car payments 3 months behind. Based on his spending patterns and the timeline of his relationships with elderly victims, I estimate he needs approximately $30,000 within the next 60 days. To avoid bankruptcy, Detective Walsh leaned forward. That matches our timeline for when we expect him to escalate pressure on Mrs. Chen. Rosa, what about the technical surveillance? Can we monitor his communications legally? Working on warrants now, Rosa replied. Detective Walsh's investigation provides probable cause. We should have authorization to monitor his phone and digital communications within 48 hours. Margaret stood and walked to her windows, looking out at the city where David Richardson was probably planning his next manipulation. I want to understand his methodology completely before we proceed. Detective Walsh, can you arrange for me to speak with his previous victims? I need to hear their stories directly. I can try, but they're understandably reluctant to revisit the trauma. Eleanor Hartwell especially, she's been devastated by the whole experience. Then I'll go to them. Sometimes healing begins when victims realize they weren't alone, that the predator who targeted them is facing real consequences. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. Mom, are you okay? David said you seemed upset last night when he dropped you off. He's worried he said something wrong. The casual manipulation in that message, the way David had positioned himself as the concerned son-in-law, worried about having somehow offended his wife's mother, was masterfully crafted. He was already beginning to control the narrative, preparing Lisa for the possibility that her mother might say something negative about their conversation. Margaret showed the message to Detective Walsh. Classic predator behavior, the detective observed. He's creating doubt about your credibility before you've even had a chance to speak with your daughter. More than that, he's conditioning Lisa to see me as the problem if tensions arise. By the time I try to warn her about his true nature, he'll have already convinced her that I'm becoming paranoid or hostile toward their marriage. Margaret typed back, "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired from a long day. David was perfectly lovely." She hated lying to her daughter, but she needed time to build an airtight case before exposing David's true nature. Lisa was psychologically vulnerable right now, isolated from her support network and financially dependent on a man who'd systematically undermined her confidence. A premature revelation could drive her deeper into David's control or prompt him to disappear before they could gather sufficient evidence for prosecution. "Rosa, I need you to coordinate with Dr. Patterson at the Trauma Recovery Center. If we're going to help my daughter heal from this psychological manipulation, we'll need expert support throughout the process." Already reaching out, she's agreed to consult on developing a recovery plan specifically tailored to victims of this type of financial and emotional abuse. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for her team's intuitive understanding of what this investigation required. They weren't just building a criminal case, they were preparing to help her daughter rebuild her life after discovering that her marriage had been an elaborate lie. "Detective Walsh, I want to make something clear. I'm not just another concerned citizen offering to help with your investigation. David Richardson chose the wrong target when he decided to manipulate my family. I have resources, connections, and capabilities that he can't imagine. If you're willing to work with me, we won't just stop him. We'll dismantle his entire operation and ensure he never victimizes another woman." The detective's smile was sharp with anticipation. "Mrs. Chen David Richardson has been operating in shadows for years, relying on his victim's shame and isolation to avoid consequences. He's about to discover what happens when he targets someone who can drag those shadows into bright light." Margaret's secure phone rang with a call from James Morrison. She activated the speaker so Detective Walsh could hear the update. "Mrs. Chen, we've uncovered something significant. Richardson has been using dating apps and social media to identify potential victims, but he's not working alone. We've traced connections to at least 3 other individuals who appear to be running similar operations. This looks like an organized network rather than a lone predator." The implications hit Margaret immediately. He's part of a criminal enterprise specifically targeting elderly women. "It gets worse," James continued. "We found evidence that they share information about victims' financial status, vulnerabilities, family situations. Richardson may have had detailed intelligence about you before he ever married your daughter." Detective Walsh was already reaching for her phone. "I need to contact the FBI. If this crosses state lines and involves organized criminal activity, it becomes a federal case." Margaret felt something cold and dangerous crystallize in her chest. David hadn't just stumbled into her family through his relationship with Lisa. He'd targeted them, deliberately calculated their potential value, and positioned himself to exploit both mother and daughter systematically. "James, I want complete background checks on every person Richardson has contacted in the past 5 years. Credit reports, employment histories, criminal records, everything. And I want surveillance on his current activities, where he goes, who he meets, what he does when he thinks no one is watching." Already in progress. We'll have comprehensive profiles by end of business today. Rosa, contact Marcus at the law firm. I want to understand Lisa's legal options if she decides to leave her marriage. Property rights, spousal support, protection orders, everything she might need to safely extract herself from this situation. Margaret ended the call and turned back to Detective Walsh. "I'm going to visit Eleanor Hartwell this afternoon. Will you come with me?" "Of course. But Mrs. Chen, I should warn you, these women have been deeply traumatized. They may not be ready to trust another person claiming to help them. Detective Walsh, I've spent my entire adult life earning trust in situations where it wasn't freely given. I built this company by proving to skeptical investors, hostile competitors, and dismissive partners that my word was absolutely reliable. If Eleanor Hartwell is willing to listen, I'll prove to her that David Richardson's ability to hurt people is about to end permanently. As they prepared to leave for the meeting with Eleanor Hartwell, Margaret felt the familiar surge of focused energy that had sustained her through decades of corporate battles. She was no longer the abandoned elderly woman from last night's train station. She was Margaret Chin, CEO of a multi-million-dollar enterprise, and she was bringing every resource at her disposal to bear against the man who'd threatened her family. David Richardson had gambled that targeting her would be profitable and low risk. Instead, he'd just awakened an adversary with the skills, resources, and motivation to destroy him completely. The war had begun, and he didn't even know it yet. Eleanor Hartwell lived in a modest garden apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where retired teachers and office workers stretch their pensions to maintain independence. Margaret and Detective Walsh found her tending a small herb garden outside her front door, her weathered hands gentle with the late-season basil and rosemary. She was smaller than Margaret had expected, perhaps 5 feet tall with silver hair pinned back practically, and intelligent brown eyes that carried the wariness of someone who'd learned to distrust appearances. When Detective Walsh made the introductions, Eleanor's expression grew guarded. Mrs. Chen, I appreciate you coming, but I'm not sure what more I can tell you about David Richardson that I haven't already told the police. It's not something I enjoy reliving. Margaret understood that wariness. She'd felt it herself in boardrooms, where she'd been the only woman where every word was scrutinized for weakness and every gesture analyzed for competence. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm not here to ask you to relive your trauma. I'm here to tell you that David Richardson made a serious mistake when he decided to target my family, and I want to make sure he never has the opportunity to hurt another woman the way he hurt you. Something in Margaret's tone, the quiet authority, the absolute certainty, made Eleanor straighten slightly. Come inside. I'll make tea. Eleanor's apartment was spotless and carefully decorated with the kinds of personal treasures that accumulated over a lifetime: photographs of former students' handmade quilts, books worn soft with repeated reading. But Margaret noticed immediately what was missing: the expensive electronics that should have been present in a comfortable retirement, the quality furniture that a lifetime of teacher savings should have afforded. David convinced me to liquidate my certificate of deposit to help him invest in a restaurant, Eleanor said quietly as she prepared tea, with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. He had business plans, photographs of the location, even fake contracts with suppliers. It all looked so legitimate. Detective Walsh had heard this story before, but Margaret was experiencing it for the first time: the systematic way David had constructed an elaborate fiction to justify stealing this woman's life savings. How long did the relationship last? Margaret asked gently. 8 months. 8 months of what I thought was the most romantic time of my life since my husband died. Eleanor's voice carried a particular kind of pain, not just financial loss, but the deeper wound of having her capacity for love weaponized against her. He brought me flowers every Friday, remembered how I liked my coffee, listened to me talk about my students and my garden. I thought I'd found someone who truly cared about me. Margaret felt her jaw tighten. This was exactly the kind of emotional manipulation David had used on Lisa. The careful cultivation of dependency disguised as devotion. Eleanor, when did you first realize something was wrong? When I tried to call him after I'd liquidated the CD and transferred the money to the account he'd provided. The phone number was disconnected. When I went to the community center where we'd met, no one had heard of him. It was like he'd never existed. Eleanor set down her teacup with hands that were no longer quite steady. The worst part wasn't losing the money, Mrs. Chen. It was realizing that everything I'd felt, everything he'd said he felt, none of it was real. I'd fallen in love with a completely fictional person. Margaret reached across the small table and covered Eleanor's hand with her own. No, you fell in love with the person David Richardson pretended to be. Your capacity for love, your willingness to trust your desire to help someone you cared about, those things are real and valuable. David's ability to exploit those qualities doesn't diminish their worth. Eleanor looked up with surprise, perhaps not expecting that kind of understanding from a stranger. Detective Walsh said you might be able to help stop him from doing this to other women. More than help stop him, Margaret said quietly. I'm going to destroy his ability to victimize anyone ever again, but I need to understand his methods completely. Can you tell me about the other people in his life? Did he ever mention family friends, business associates? He talked about his wife sometimes. Lisa, I think her name was. He said she was going through a difficult time, struggling with depression and financial anxiety. He portrayed himself as this devoted husband, trying to protect her from additional stress while managing their family's problems. Margaret felt sick. David had been using Lisa's genuine struggles as part of his manipulation narrative, turning her daughter's private pain into a tool for exploiting other women's sympathy. Did he ever suggest that you might meet his wife? Never. He said she was very private, didn't like meeting new people because of her depression. Looking back, I realize he was making sure his different victims never connected with each other. Detective Walsh leaned forward. Eleanor, we've discovered that David has been involved with at least 4 women simultaneously over the past 2 years. You weren't his only victim, you were part of a coordinated operation. Eleanor's face went pale. 4 women at the same time. We believe so. Different stories, different financial emergencies, but the same basic methodology. And we think he's connected to other men running similar operations. Margaret's phone buzzed with a secure message from James Morrison. She read it quickly, then looked up with an expression that made both women lean back slightly. Eleanor, Detective Walsh, I just received an update from my investigative team. David Richardson isn't just connected to other financial predators, he's been systematically researching wealthy elderly women in this region for over 3 years. He has detailed files on potential targets, including their financial status, family situations, and psychological vulnerabilities. How detailed? Detective Walsh asked. Margaret scrolled through the message, her expression growing darker. Detailed enough that he knew about my corporate background and estimated net worth before he ever met my daughter. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was a carefully planned operation to infiltrate and exploit my family. Eleanor's teacup rattled against its saucer. You mean he specifically targeted your daughter to get access to you? That's exactly what I mean. Lisa wasn't David's wife, she was his entry point to a much larger score. Margaret's voice carried the kind of cold fury that had once made hostile corporate raiders reconsider their strategies. He's been playing a years-long con game, and my daughter has been an unwitting accomplice in her own mother's planned victimization. Detective Walsh was already reaching for her phone. Mrs. Chen, if this is true, if Richardson has been operating a systematic targeting operation, we're looking at federal racketeering charges. This goes far beyond simple fraud. It gets worse, Margaret said, continuing to read James's report. The files suggest that David has been gradually isolating Lisa from her support network while documenting her emotional and financial dependencies. He's not just using her as cover for his other crimes, he's systematically preparing her to be completely helpless if he decides to abandon her or if his operation is exposed. Eleanor stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger. That monster! That absolute monster! She's as much his victim as any of us, and she doesn't even know it. No, she doesn't, Margaret agreed. And that's what makes this so dangerous. Lisa loves him, trusts him completely, and has no idea that her entire marriage has been an elaborate criminal enterprise. Margaret's phone rang with a call from Rosa. She answered on speaker so the others could hear the update. Mrs. Chen, we've just received the financial surveillance reports. Richardson has been moving money through multiple accounts, but we've traced the pattern. In the past 18 months, he's stolen approximately $230,000 from elderly women in 6 different states. The number hit the room like a physical blow. Eleanor sank back into her chair, perhaps finally understanding the true scope of the operation she'd been caught in. Rosa, what about the organized crime connections? FBI liaison confirms that Richardson is connected to a network of at least 12 individuals running similar operations across the eastern seaboard. They call themselves relationship specialists and share intelligence about potential targets through encrypted communications. Detective Walsh was furiously taking notes. Mrs. Chen, with this level of evidence, we can bring down the entire network. But we need to move carefully. If Richardson suspects he's under investigation, he could disappear and take your daughter with him. Margaret felt the pieces of a larger strategy beginning to form in her mind. No, he won't disappear. David Richardson thinks he's close to his biggest score ever, manipulating me into transferring substantial assets to resolve his financial problems. He's not going to abandon that opportunity unless he's absolutely certain he's been exposed. What are you proposing? I'm going to give him exactly what he thinks he wants. I'm going to appear vulnerable, desperate, and ready to make the financial arrangements he's been pushing for. And while he's focused on stealing from me, we're going to document every aspect of his criminal operation and gather evidence on his entire network. Eleanor looked between Margaret and Detective Walsh with growing understanding. You're going to pretend to be his victim while you're actually hunting him. More than that, I'm going to use his greed and arrogance against him. David Richardson has spent years perfecting his ability to manipulate elderly women because he believes we're inherently weak and helpless. He's about to discover what happens when someone with real power decides to play his game. Margaret stood her decision crystallizing with corporate finality. Detective Walsh, I need you to coordinate with the FBI on the broader investigation, but I want to handle David Richardson personally. He made this personal when he targeted my family. Mrs. Chen, what exactly are you planning? Margaret smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, it was a smile with teeth. I'm planning to teach David Richardson the most expensive lesson of his life. He's about to learn that the most dangerous predator in any ecosystem isn't the one that looks the most threatening. It's the one that looks like easy prey until it's too late to escape. As they prepared to leave Eleanor's apartment, the older woman caught Margaret's arm. Mrs. Chen, I want to help. Whatever you're planning, I want to be part of it. David Richardson stole more than money from me. He stole my ability to trust my own judgment. I want to be there when he faces the consequences of what he's done. Margaret looked into Eleanor's eyes and saw the same steel that had sustained her through decades of corporate warfare. Eleanor, I think David Richardson is about to discover that the women he's been targeting aren't nearly as helpless as he assumed, and that discovery is going to cost him everything. Margaret returned to her office that evening with the focused intensity of a general preparing for decisive battle. She'd spent the afternoon with Eleanor Hartwell and Detective Walsh, and now she understood the full scope of what she was facing. David Richardson wasn't just a common criminal. He was part of a sophisticated operation that had been targeting vulnerable women for years. But what David didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that Margaret Chen had been preparing for exactly this kind of war her entire professional life. She activated her secure conference system and assembled her core team: James Morrison, her head of security; Rosa Martinez, her executive assistant and operational coordinator; Marcus Webb, her chief legal counsel; and Dr. Patricia Patterson, the trauma psychologist who specialized in helping victims of sophisticated manipulation. The situation is more complex than we initially understood. Margaret began, her voice carrying the calm authority that had guided Chin Enterprises through hostile takeovers and corporate espionage attempts. David Richardson is part of an organized criminal network, and they've been targeting my family for years. This isn't just about protecting Lisa and prosecuting David. We're going to dismantle an entire operation. James Morrison's voice came through the speakers first. Mrs. Chen, I've completed the financial analysis. Richardson's network has stolen over $2 million from elderly victims in the past 3 years. The sophistication of their psychological profiling and targeting methodologies suggests they have access to professional resources, possibly corrupt financial advisors, dating site employees, or social services workers who provide insider information about vulnerable individuals. Margaret absorbed this information while Rosa distributed detailed dossiers on each member of David's network. The scope of the operation was staggering: 12 active perpetrators, dozens of victims, and a support infrastructure that included fake business registrations, fraudulent investment accounts, and elaborate digital identities designed to pass background checks. Marcus, what are our legal options? Can we pursue civil action while the criminal investigation proceeds? Marcus Webb had been Margaret's attorney for 20 years, a man whose understanding of corporate warfare made him invaluable in situations requiring both legal precision and strategic thinking. We can pursue multiple avenues simultaneously: asset forfeiture, civil racketeering charges, and individual fraud claims. More importantly, we can use the discovery process in civil litigation to gather evidence that might not be available through criminal channels. Explain. Criminal investigations have strict rules about evidence gathering and surveillance. Civil litigation has broader discovery powers. We can subpoena records, conduct depositions, and compel testimony that might help both our case and the federal investigation. Dr. Patterson's voice joined the conversation with the kind of clinical insight Margaret had learned to value in complex human situations. Mrs. Chen, I've reviewed the psychological profiles of David Richardson and his network. These individuals are classic psychopathic predators. They feel no genuine empathy for their victims and view relationships purely as opportunities for exploitation. The danger for your daughter isn't just financial or emotional. It's that David may become violent if he feels cornered or if his operation is threatened. What kind of violence? Domestic abuse is common when financial predators lose control over their primary cover relationships. David has invested 3 years in establishing Lisa as his legitimate facade. If that investment is threatened, he may escalate to physical control methods or attempt to isolate her completely from potential help. Margaret felt her jaw tighten. The possibility that David might hurt Lisa physically added urgency to every aspect of their planning. Dr. Patterson, what's the safest way to extract Lisa from this situation without triggering escalation? Gradually and carefully. We need to rebuild her support network and financial independence before revealing the truth about David's activities. If she discovers everything suddenly without adequate preparation, she may defend him or refuse to believe the evidence. Trauma bonding with manipulative partners is extremely powerful. Rosa had been taking notes throughout the conversation, and now she spoke with the practical precision that made her invaluable in crisis situations. Mrs. Chen, I've prepared 3 operational plans based on different timeline assumptions. Do you want to proceed slowly to minimize risk to Lisa quickly, to prevent David from stealing more money from other victims, or with a hybrid approach that balances both concerns? Margaret stood and walked to her windows, looking out at the city lights, while her mind processed the strategic calculations. In corporate takeovers, timing was everything. Move too quickly and your target could mount effective defenses. Move too slowly and competitors could interfere with your plans. But this wasn't about corporate acquisition. This was about protecting her daughter and stopping a criminal operation that was actively harming vulnerable people. Every day it continued. Hybrid approach, she decided. We'll move aggressively against David's financial resources and criminal network while proceeding carefully with Lisa's psychological preparation. Rosa, I want surveillance on David beginning immediately. I need to know everyone he contacts, everywhere he goes, every financial transaction he makes. Already arranged, James has a team in place as of 6 p.m. today. Marcus began preparing civil litigation against David and his known associates. I want their assets frozen and their ability to move money eliminated. Make it look like routine debt collection or business disputes. Nothing that would suggest criminal investigation. Understood. I'll have preliminary filings ready by tomorrow morning. Dr. Patterson, I need you to begin working with Lisa immediately but carefully. Can you arrange to meet her through the art therapy program she's taking? Yes, I have connections at the university. I can introduce myself as a consultant on a research project about art therapy applications. It would give me legitimate reasons to spend time with her and assess her psychological state. Margaret felt the familiar satisfaction of a complex plan coming together with precision timing. James, what's our intelligence on David's immediate plans? Based on his communications and financial pressures, we estimate he'll escalate his approach with you within the next week. His debts are reaching critical status, and he needs a substantial cash infusion to maintain his operation. Perfect. Rosa arranged for me to have lunch with Lisa tomorrow. I want to begin preparing her psychologically while documenting David's manipulation attempts. Should I record the conversation? Yes, but carefully. I want evidence of his influence on her thinking, but I don't want to create legal complications later. Margaret returned to her desk, feeling the pieces of her strategy aligning with mechanical precision. David Richardson had made the mistake of targeting someone who'd spent 40 years perfecting the art of strategic destruction. One more thing, she said to her assembled team. I want to offer protection and support to all of David's previous victims. Eleanor Hartwell, Patricia Martinez, Diane Foster, all of them. They've been isolated and traumatized by this operation, and they deserve to see justice done. Mrs. Chen, Dr. Patterson said carefully, involving the other victims could be psychologically healing for them, but it also increases the complexity of the operation. Are you sure you want to take on that additional responsibility? Margaret smiled grimly. Dr. Patterson, David Richardson has built his entire criminal career on the assumption that elderly women are isolated, powerless, and ashamed to seek help. I'm about to demonstrate what happens when his victims unite with someone who has the resources to fight back effectively. She ended the conference call and sat alone in her office, the city spreading out below her like a chessboard, where David Richardson thought he was playing a simple game against an easy opponent. Instead, he was about to face a grandmaster who'd been anticipating his moves for decades. Margaret opened her personal safe and removed a small encrypted device, a communication system she'd used in the most sensitive corporate negotiations, where any leaked information could cost millions of dollars. She activated it and placed a call to a number she'd memorized but never written down. Alexander Petrov, came the answer after 2 rings. Alexander, it's Margaret Chen. I need a favor. Alexander Petrov was a former CIA operative who'd transitioned into private security consulting for multinational corporations. His specialty was gathering intelligence in situations where traditional legal methods were insufficient. Margaret, it's been 5 years since the Shanghai acquisition? Something like that. Alexander, I need deep background intelligence on a criminal network operating financial fraud schemes against elderly victims, beyond what law enforcement can gather through normal channels. How deep? Deep enough to destroy them completely. Personal histories, financial records, family connections, psychological profiles, everything that could be used to dismantle their operation and ensure they never target vulnerable people again. There was a pause. This is personal. They targeted my family, Alexander. They made it personal. Standard rates plus expenses, double rates plus expenses, and Alexander time is critical. I need actionable intelligence within 72 hours. Understood. Transmit the target information to my secure server and consider it done. Margaret ended the call and leaned back in her chair, feeling the cold satisfaction of having deployed resources that David Richardson couldn't imagine existed. He'd spent years perfecting his ability to manipulate women he considered powerless and isolated. He was about to discover what happened when he targeted someone who'd built an empire specifically designed to protect vulnerable people from predators exactly like him. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lisa Mom David, and I were wondering if you'd like to come to dinner again this weekend. He said you two had such a nice conversation on the drive to the train station, and he'd love to continue getting to know you better. Margaret stared at that message, recognizing the careful manipulation in David's supposed eagerness to continue getting to know the woman he'd abandoned at an empty train station. He was positioning himself for another opportunity to pressure her about financial arrangements, probably hoping that a week of reflection had made her more receptive to his proposals. She typed back, "That sounds lovely, sweetheart. I've been doing some thinking about family financial planning, and I'd welcome the chance to discuss it with both of you." It wasn't a lie. She had been thinking about family financial planning, specifically how to use David's greed and desperation to gather evidence that would destroy him completely. Margaret gathered her files and prepared to leave the office, but she paused at her window for one final look at the city where David Richardson thought he was the predator hunting easy prey. By this time next week, he'd understand his mistake completely, and it would be far too late for him to do anything about it. The setting Margaret chose for David Richardson's destruction was as carefully calculated as every other aspect of her strategy. The annual Chin Enterprises Community Foundation Gala was being held at the Grand Meridian Hotel, with 300 of the city's most influential citizens in attendance, business leaders, politicians, judges, and media figures who would ensure that David's humiliation was both public and permanent. What made the venue perfect wasn't just the audience, but the occasion itself. The Foundation's mission was protecting vulnerable elderly citizens from financial exploitation, and this year's keynote speaker was FBI Director Patricia Morrison, who would be discussing federal efforts to combat elder abuse. David had no idea he was walking into a trap. He thought he was attending a charity dinner where his wife's wealthy mother would be honored for her philanthropic work, an opportunity to network with potential future victims while cementing his image as a loving family man. Margaret arrived early wearing an elegant navy dress that projected exactly the right combination of dignity and authority. She'd spent the morning in final preparation with her team reviewing evidence, confirming legal protocols, and ensuring that every aspect of David's exposure would be documented for both criminal prosecution and civil litigation. Eleanor Hartwell was there too, along with Patricia Martinez and Diane Foster David's previous victims, who'd agreed to attend as guests of the foundation. They sat at a table near the front, their presence invisible to David, but symbolically powerful for Margaret. Tonight wasn't just about destroying one predator. It was about giving voice to the women he'd silenced through shame and isolation. Lisa arrived at 7 o'clock wearing a dress that Margaret recognized as one of her favorites from college, before David had convinced her to sell most of her wardrobe to help with their financial problems. Her daughter looked tired but happy, genuinely excited about attending such a prestigious event. She had no idea that before the evening was over, her entire world would be transformed. David entered the ballroom with the confident stride of a man who believed he was about to achieve his greatest victory. He'd spent the week since their train station encounter carefully pressuring Margaret through Lisa, using his wife as an unwitting messenger to suggest family financial meetings and discuss elderly care planning. What he didn't know was that every conversation had been recorded, every manipulation documented, and every lie cataloged as evidence in a criminal case that now involved federal racketeering charges. Margaret, David approached with arms extended, playing the role of the devoted son-in-law for the watching crowd. You look absolutely wonderful tonight. Lisa and I are so proud to be here supporting your foundation's important work. Margaret accepted his embrace with the serene smile she'd perfected during decades of corporate negotiations with people she intended to destroy. David, how lovely to see you. I'm so glad you could both attend. There are some people I'd like you to meet. She guided David and Lisa toward a group that included Detective Walsh, FBI Director Morrison, and U.S. Attorney James Franklin, though David had no way of knowing their true identities or the significance of their presence. David Richardson, Margaret said smoothly. I'd like you to meet some friends of mine. Detective Sarah Walsh, FBI Director Patricia Morrison, and U.S. Attorney James Franklin. They've been very interested in hearing about your work in community outreach and elderly care advocacy. David's handshake was firm and confident as he greeted each official launching into his practice narrative about caring for aging family members and supporting vulnerable seniors. Margaret watched him perform, marveling at the ease with which he lied to law enforcement officers while describing himself as a protector of the very people he'd been systematically victimizing. Mr. Richardson, FBI Director Morrison said with polite interest, Margaret tells me you've been quite involved in financial planning for elderly family members. That's such important work, especially given the rise in elder financial abuse cases we're seeing. Absolutely, David replied, warming to his theme. It's tragic how many seniors are taken advantage of by unscrupulous people who see them as easy targets. Family members need to step up and provide protection and guidance. The irony was so perfect that Margaret had to suppress a smile. David was literally describing his own crimes while positioning himself as a protector of his victims. Lisa beamed at her husband's apparent compassion. David has been so helpful with planning for Mom's future needs. He's always thinking about how to make sure she's secure and well cared for as she gets older. How thoughtful, U.S. Attorney Franklin observed. And what specific arrangements have you found most effective for protecting elderly assets from exploitation? David launched into a detailed explanation of joint account management power of attorney transfers and asset consolidation, essentially describing his criminal methodology while presenting it as legitimate elder care planning. With each word, he was providing prosecutors with recorded admissions of his modus operandi. Margaret excused herself as the dinner service began, ostensibly to check on final preparations for the evening's program. In reality, she was coordinating with her security team and ensuring that all recording equipment was functioning properly. Rosa, she said quietly into her secure communication device, is everything ready? Audio and video recording, active legal team standing by, and media coordination confirmed. Mrs. Chen, are you certain you want to proceed with full exposure tonight? Margaret looked across the ballroom at David, who was now charming a table of wealthy widows with stories about his devotion to elderly care. Several of them were discreetly providing him with their contact information, potential future victims who had no idea they were speaking with a career predator. I'm certain David Richardson has had 3 years to demonstrate that he's capable of change or remorse. Instead, he's escalated his criminal activity and targeted my family. Tonight, his ability to victimize vulnerable women ends permanently. The dinner proceeded with the usual charitable function atmosphere, polite conversation, philanthropic presentations, and award ceremonies recognizing community leaders. Margaret was honored for her foundation's work in elder abuse prevention, accepting the recognition with gracious humility, while internally counting down to the moment when the evening's true purpose would be revealed. David applauded enthusiastically for his mother-in-law's award, playing the proud family member while calculating how her public recognition might enhance his credibility with potential victims. He had no idea that he was literally applauding the woman who was about to destroy him. FBI Director Morrison took the podium for the keynote address, beginning with statistics about elder financial abuse and the federal response to organized criminal networks targeting vulnerable seniors. The audience listened with polite attention, unaware that they were about to witness one of the most dramatic criminal exposures in the city's history. Ladies and gentlemen, Director Morrison continued, tonight I want to share with you a case study that demonstrates both the sophistication of modern elder abuse operations and the power of community cooperation in bringing criminals to justice. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. This was the moment she'd been planning for weeks, the convergence of evidence timing and public exposure that would ensure David Richardson's complete destruction. Over the past year, federal agents have been investigating a criminal network that has stolen over $2 million from elderly victims across 6 states. The sophistication of this operation is remarkable. They use psychological profiling, digital surveillance, and long-term relationship manipulation to identify and exploit vulnerable individuals. David was still listening with apparent interest, perhaps thinking this was simply an educational presentation about crimes committed by other people. Lisa looked concerned but engaged, unaware that her husband was the subject of the federal investigation being described. The network's methodology, Director Morrison continued, involves identifying elderly women through dating sites, community centers, and social services. The perpetrators create elaborate fictional identities and spend months building trust before introducing financial emergencies that require immediate assistance. Margaret watched David's expression begin to change slightly. The first flicker of unease as the description became uncomfortably specific to his own methods. In one particularly egregious case, a member of this network married a younger woman specifically to gain access to her wealthy mother. The marriage was never genuine. It was simply a long-term cover operation designed to position the criminal for a major theft. Lisa's hand went to her throat, her face paling as she began to understand the implications of what was being said. Around their table, other guests were listening with growing intensity, some beginning to glance toward David with dawning recognition. Ladies and gentlemen, Director Morrison said, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement, I'm pleased to announce that this criminal network has been completely dismantled. 12 individuals have been arrested, over $1 million in stolen assets have been recovered, and the victims are finally receiving justice. The ballroom erupted in applause, but Margaret was watching David's face as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his arrogance. His confident expression was cracking, replaced by the calculating look of a cornered predator assessing escape routes. Director Morrison raised her hand for silence. Tonight, we have the opportunity to recognize someone whose courage and resources made this prosecution possible. Mrs. Margaret Chen, would you please join me on stage? Margaret rose with calm dignity, walking to the podium while 300 influential citizens applauded her community service. She accepted the microphone and looked out at the audience, her gaze settling briefly on David's increasingly panicked face. Thank you, Director Morrison. Ladies and gentlemen, the criminal network that has been dismantled tonight became personal for me when one of its members targeted my family. David Richardson, who is here with us this evening, spent 3 years cultivating a relationship with my daughter, specifically to gain access to what he believed were my vulnerable assets. The ballroom fell silent. Margaret could see people at David's table beginning to lean away from him, their faces registering shock and disgust as they realized they'd been dining with a federal criminal. David abandoned me at an empty train station 2 weeks ago, believing that a night of helplessness would make me more receptive to his financial manipulation. What he didn't understand was that Margaret Chin doesn't remain helpless for long. Margaret activated the large screens throughout the ballroom, displaying financial records, recorded conversations, and surveillance photographs that documented David's crimes in devastating detail. Ladies and gentlemen, you're looking at evidence of a 3-year criminal operation that stole the life savings of vulnerable elderly women while using my daughter as unwitting cover for these activities. David shot to his feet, his face flushed with rage and panic. "This is insane, Margaret! What are you doing? These people don't understand we're family." "No, David," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. "You're a federal criminal who targeted my family. The people who understand that are the FBI agents who are about to arrest you." As if summoned by her words, federal agents emerged from positions throughout the ballroom, moving toward David with professional efficiency. The audience watched in stunned silence as handcuffs were produced, and David Richardson realized that his criminal career was ending in the most public way possible. David Richardson, Agent Morrison announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You're under arrest for federal racketeering, elder abuse, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes against vulnerable adults." David's composure finally shattered completely. "You can't do this. I have rights. Margaret, tell them this is all a misunderstanding." Margaret stepped closer to the microphone, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had sustained her through decades of corporate warfare. "David, the only misunderstanding was yours. You assumed that an elderly woman living modestly must be vulnerable and powerless. You never considered that she might be someone with the resources and determination to destroy you completely." The ballroom erupted in applause as David was led away in handcuffs, his protest growing fainter as he disappeared through the exit. Margaret remained at the podium feeling the profound satisfaction of having protected not just her own family, but countless future victims from a dangerous predator. Lisa sat at their table in shocked tears streaming down her face as she processed the complete transformation of everything she'd believed about her marriage. Eleanor Hartwell, Patricia Martinez, and Diane Foster were embracing each other, finally seeing their abuser face consequences for his crimes. Margaret returned to the microphone for her final words of the evening. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight demonstrates that predators who target our elderly citizens will face the full consequences of their crimes. But more importantly, it shows that when communities unite to protect vulnerable members, justice prevails." The standing ovation that followed was thunderous, but Margaret's attention was focused on her daughter, who would need all the support and love her mother could provide to heal from this betrayal. David Richardson's reign of terror was over. The real work of healing could now begin. 3 months after David Richardson's dramatic arrest at the Chin Foundation Gala, Margaret sat in federal court listening to Judge Patricia Hawkins deliver a sentence that would ensure David never victimized another vulnerable woman. "Mr. Richardson," Judge Hawkins said, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, "you have been convicted of federal racketeering, elder abuse, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges involving the systematic theft of over $2 million from vulnerable elderly victims. The court finds that your crimes demonstrate a callous disregard for human dignity and a calculated exploitation of society's most vulnerable members." David sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his once confident demeanor replaced by the hollow expression of a man who'd finally run out of manipulation tactics. His court-appointed attorney had attempted to negotiate a plea bargain, but Margaret's evidence had been so comprehensive that prosecutors had no incentive to offer reduced charges. The court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for 15 years. Additionally, you are ordered to pay full restitution to your victims in the amount of $2. $3 million, and you are permanently barred from accessing financial services or managing assets for other individuals. Eleanor Hartwell, Patricia Martinez, and Diane Foster sat in the gallery behind Margaret holding hands as they watched their abuser face consequences that had seemed impossible just months earlier. The FBI's investigation had recovered most of their stolen money through asset forfeiture from David's criminal network, but more importantly, they'd regained their sense of agency and self-worth. Lisa wasn't present for the sentencing. She was at the residential treatment facility, where she'd been recovering from the psychological trauma of discovering that her 3-year marriage had been an elaborate criminal conspiracy. Dr. Patterson had recommended intensive therapy to help her process the betrayal and rebuild her capacity for trust. Mrs. Chinta Judge Hawkins continued, "The court recognizes your extraordinary cooperation in this investigation and the courage you demonstrated in exposing this criminal network. Your actions have prevented countless future victims from suffering the harm inflicted by Mr. Richardson and his associates." After the sentencing, Margaret met with U.S. Attorney Franklin and FBI Director Morrison to discuss the broader implications of the case. The investigation had led to the arrest of David's entire criminal network, the recovery of millions in stolen assets, and the implementation of new federal protocols for identifying and prosecuting elder abuse cases. Margaret, Director Morrison said as they stood outside the courthouse, "I want you to know that this case has become a model for how law enforcement and private resources can cooperate to protect vulnerable citizens. The Chin Foundation's Victim Support Program has already been replicated in 12 other cities." Margaret felt deep satisfaction knowing that her personal battle against David Richardson had created systemic change that would protect countless other families. Director Morrison, predators like David rely on their victims' isolation and shame to avoid consequences. When we unite to shine light on their activities, they become powerless. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the art therapy center that had been built with Lisa's input and Chin Foundation funding. Her daughter was painting again bold, vibrant canvases that reflected her growing emotional strength and renewed sense of purpose. "Mom," Lisa said, adding a stroke of brilliant blue to the painting she'd been working on all morning, "I've been thinking about what I want to do next with my life." Lisa had completed her art therapy certification during her recovery working with Dr. Patterson to transform her own healing process into skills that could help other trauma survivors. The marriage to David had been legally annulled after evidence proved it had been entered into fraudulently, and Lisa had reclaimed her maiden name with pride. "I want to work with the foundation full-time," Lisa continued, "specifically with women who've survived financial abuse and relationship manipulation. I understand their experience in ways that most therapists can't." Margaret felt tears of pride gathering in her eyes. Her daughter had taken the most devastating betrayal imaginable and transformed it into a calling to help others heal from similar trauma. "Lisa, that sounds perfect. You've always had a gift for helping people express their pain through art. Now you can help them transform that pain into strength." Eleanor Hartwell had become the Foundation's volunteer coordinator, using her experience as a retired teacher to develop educational programs about financial scam prevention. Patricia Martinez managed victim support services, and Diane Foster worked with law enforcement agencies to improve their response to elder abuse cases. David's former victims had become powerful advocates for systemic change, their shared experience creating bonds of friendship and mutual support that extended far beyond their initial trauma. A year after David's sentencing, Margaret received a letter forwarded through the federal prison system. David had written from his cell, apparently hoping to manipulate her into providing legal or financial assistance for his appeal efforts. Margaret, the letter began. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive the misunderstandings that led to our current situation. I've had time to reflect on my actions, and I realize that my financial pressures may have caused me to make decisions that appeared inappropriate. I'm hoping that as family, we can work together to resolve these issues and move forward with mutual understanding. Margaret read the letter twice, marveling at David's continued inability to accept responsibility for his crimes. Even facing decades in prison, he was still attempting to manipulate her through false apologies and appeals to family loyalty. She filed the letter in her security records and never responded. David Richardson had forfeited any claim to her consideration when he'd chosen to target her family for criminal exploitation. 2 years after the trial, Margaret stood before the Senate Committee on Aging testifying about federal legislation to strengthen elder abuse protections. Her experience with David Richardson had transformed her from a private philanthropist into a national advocate for vulnerable seniors. Senators, she said, addressing the committee with the same authority she'd once used in corporate boardrooms. Financial predators target elderly Americans because they believe we're isolated, ashamed, and powerless to fight back. The legislation you're considering will provide law enforcement with the tools they need to protect our communities from these criminals. The Chin Foundation had grown into a national organization with chapters in 37 states providing comprehensive support for elder abuse victims and their families. Lisa had become the foundation's clinical director, combining her artistic gifts with her hard-won understanding of trauma recovery to develop innovative treatment programs. Eleanor Hartwell, now 81, had become a sought-after speaker at law enforcement conferences, sharing her insights about predator psychology and victim psychology with officers across the country. Her quiet teacher's voice had become a powerful instrument for justice and social change. On the third anniversary of David's arrest, Margaret hosted a dinner at her penthouse apartment for the women whose lives had been transformed by their shared experience. Eleanor, Patricia, Diane, and Lisa gathered around Margaret's dining table, their conversation flowing with the easy intimacy of survivors who'd built new lives from the wreckage of their former selves. You know what I realized today? Lisa said, raising her wine glass in a toast. David thought he was targeting weak, vulnerable women who would be easy victims. Instead, he accidentally assembled a group of the strongest, most determined women I've ever known. Eleanor laughed, her brown eyes bright with humor and wisdom. He certainly didn't expect us to organize against him. Predators rely on keeping their victims isolated and ashamed. When we connected with each other, his power evaporated. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. The foundation has helped over 800 women in 3 years. Every one of them represents a victory against the kind of person David was. Margaret looked around the table at these remarkable women who transformed personal trauma into social mission, individual pain into collective strength. David Richardson thought he could exploit our vulnerabilities for his profit. Instead, he accidentally created a force for justice that will protect vulnerable people for generations to come. As the evening wound down, Margaret stood on her balcony looking out at the city lights reflecting on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. David Richardson was serving his sentence in federal prison. His criminal network had been dismantled, and the victims he'd targeted had become powerful advocates for social change. But perhaps most importantly, her daughter Lisa had emerged from her ordeal stronger and more purposeful than ever before. The Art Therapy Center was thriving, the foundation was expanding nationally, and lives were being saved every day through the work they'd built from the ashes of David's crimes. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Rosa, who remained her trusted executive assistant, and closest confidant, Mrs. Chin, the FBI, called with an update. David Richardson's parole application has been denied. He'll serve his full sentence. Margaret smiled and deleted the message. David Richardson was no longer her concern. He was a closed chapter in a story that had become much larger than his crimes, a story about resilience, justice, and the power of survivors to create meaning from their pain. She'd begun this journey as an abandoned elderly woman sitting on a cold train station bench, feeling vulnerable and alone. She was ending it as the founder of a national movement that had transformed how society protected its most vulnerable members. David Richardson had gambled that targeting Margaret Chin would be profitable and low risk. Instead, he'd awakened a force for justice that would outlive them all. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying the sounds of a city where vulnerable people could now access resources and support that hadn't existed before David's crimes brought them together. Margaret pulled her sweater closer and smiled, knowing that sometimes the most beautiful justice grew from the darkest betrayals. David Richardson had tried to destroy her family. Instead, he'd helped her build something that would protect families for generations to come. And that, Margaret thought as she headed back inside to rejoin her chosen family of survivors, was the sweetest revenge of all. And that's how David Richardson learned the most expensive lesson of his criminal career. He thought he was targeting a helpless elderly woman with modest savings. Instead, he declared war on a business empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Margaret Chin proved that true power isn't about appearing strong, it's about being underestimated by the right people at the right time. While David spent 3 years positioning himself to steal what he thought were her life savings, she was quietly building the resources needed to destroy him completely. Today, David is serving 25 years in federal prison. The Chin Foundation has helped over 800 women escape financial abuse. And Margaret, she's become a national advocate for elder protection, proving that sometimes the best revenge is building something beautiful from the ashes of someone else's cruelty. The next time someone assumes that quiet strength means weakness, they might want to remember Margaret Chin's story. Because the most dangerous predator in any ecosystem isn't the one that looks threatening, it's the one that looks like easy prey until it's far too late to escape. What did you think of Margaret's calculated revenge? Have you ever been underestimated in a way that worked to your advantage? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of hidden strength and perfect justice, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow, I have another incredible tale that will remind you that karma sometimes needs a little help from someone with the resources to deliver it properly.